this invitation and for your interest in this tremendously important but somehow marginalized topic. I would say that there is always a lot of interest from side of journalists and media, but the question is always for rape, sexual violence victims and survivors. How much attention is really there for them to receive support, either psychological support or compensation, which they should be entitled to. So I'm speaking from Zagreb. I work in Documenta, human rights organization and documentation center, and we are busy with documenting what happened, not just in the wars of 90s, roughly speaking, lasting from 1991 to 2001 in whole region. So in Croatia from 91 to 95, in Bosnia and Herzegovina from 92 to 95, in Kosovo 98 and 99, and finally finishing with final armed conflict in dissolution of former Yugoslavia in Macedonia in 2001. So we normally speak about this period from 91 to 95 in Croatia and 91 to 2001 in whole region. And it is that I will focus on 3 countries as the largest number of the sexual violence victims and survivors have been either living and lost their lives there, or are still living in the 3 countries. These are Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. And I will, as Mary Jo have rightfully announced, speak more from perspective of direct support to survivors and judicial prosecution of humanitarian laws violations committed than from historical perspective. So it's that I will actually lead you through some numerical aspects. First of all, I will say that as human rights organization, we document human losses, and human rights organizations have eventually said that in whole region, more than 130,000 people have been either forcibly disappeared or killed. So just that I give you perspective. And when we speak about the victims and survivors of sexual violence during war, for Croatia, the number is estimated in analysis from 2014, which was made by United Nations Development Program and domestic experts in order to secure a background for law, that there might have been around 3,000 women, men, and children who were victims of sexual violence. So I'll be repeating this: women, men, and children, as this is the reality. The largest group being women, but men also being a significant number of victims and survivors due to large number of the internment camps. This is something what might be a difference from situation which you're familiar with from historical perspective, from Second World War, but this is our reality. And it's that sexual violence was something characteristic for every detention center. We don't know a detention center where there wouldn't be some kind of sexual violence, not necessarily qualified as rape, according to the criminal code, but different kinds of sexual violence. So it's that in Croatia, the law providing a framework for compensation was passed in 2015. And there is significant difference between the number which was placed in analysis and later number of applications as up to today, we barely have more than 200 applications according to this law. So there is a big difference between number of applicants and estimated number of victims and survivors. Of course, some victims have died in meantime. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in period from 92 to 95, the number of estimated victims and survivors varies between 20,000 and 50,000. So it's that it is very difficult to come close to real number, obviously due to silence and feelings of shame, which are still there. But women organizations, but also the official institutions and United Nations actually cannot really make a closer estimation. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the legal framework for compensation have eventually also been passed after 2010, but only in one entity. Bosnia and Herzegovina has two entities, and it is that only in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, women gain a possibility to secure a status of war victim, and more than 800 of them have eventually used this possibility. But there is still no state level framework for compensation, and that remains a problem, and some recent decisions of UN bodies have been related to that fact, as in the second of Bosnia and Herzegovina entities in Republic Srpska, actually the status of survivors is still not granted and is still not possible to secure it. In Kosovo, where thousands of women were raped in period 98 to 99. Although there is still this situation, it goes for Bosnia and Herzegovina, women, men, and children, and it goes for Kosovo, women, men, and children. The law have been prepared and passed in 2014. It's actually that existing law on rights of war victims and veterans have been amended, and rape and sexual violence during war have been included in legislation. And there are now already more than 800 applications, and still applications are coming. So it's that gradually a status of sexual violence survivors is being secured through laws, and some compensation is secured. But when you look at the whole period from the time when rape have been committed or sexual violence has been committed from 91 on, then what comes clearly in a focus is that eventually these laws or amendments to existing laws have been actually passed in period after 2014, which is more than 20 years later from the moment of committing rape. I have to say that concerning direct support, that was mostly provided by women feminist organizations. So it's that it is not something what was really dealt with in a proper fashion very early. I would say that in a war in Croatia with biggest armed conflicts actually committed in 91, although it lasted until 95, rape was even not really spoken about as a crime committed. The story of rape came in focus only in 92 with systematic rapes in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And first it came in focus through systematic rapes committed by members of Serbian military in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And just later, it actually became clear that also Croatian Council of Defense members and members of Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina have been committing rape. The picture of sexual violence against men became visible much later, and the silence of men it's still more solid and more present than silence of women. So it's that with the global story and the global coverage of rape cases and systematic rape practices in Bosnia and Herzegovina, actually the story became present also in Croatia, and finally also a rape of women in Croatia became story in 92. And this is something what I'm mentioning as the journalist coverage played a very important role. But that was not sufficient to secure a direct support for survivors. So it's that we had this later wave of campaigns from side of organizations of survivors and women organizations, which finally secured legislation more than 20 years later. And when we speak about the justice, and when we speak about the topic of this forum, in first line, historical justice, then I would like to address the question, which kind of justice survivors expect? And we could speak from perspective of historical justice, as you did in previous forums, and from perspective of general redress of past wrongs, addressing history of prosecution at sites of crimes. We might look at commemorating individual victims or groups of victims, or simply advocating remembrance while pointing at silences and absences. And in sexual violence cases, whoever was a victim, either women or men in detention centers or children, there are still silences and absences and shame. And I have to say that silence has been more pronounced among male survivors. Although female survivors in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo still find it difficult to speak. We might look at justice from perspective of retributive justice, including set of judicial measures as prosecution at international tribunals, and in our case, International Criminal Tribunal for War Crimes in former Yugoslavia, and its follow-up mechanism, International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals, have been very important, as there have been actually prosecutions of rape in more than 30 cases of indictees from Kunarac to others, and actually there was a significant criminal prosecution leading to a significant corpus of sentences. And it is that International Criminal Tribunal for War Crimes in former Yugoslavia have actually produced also documentary, which you might see on their webpage, which is covering this groundbreaking territory, as it was between the first so serious prosecutions of rape and sexual violence during war. And it is important corpus also for International Criminal Court, which is in operation and will have a possibility of using experiences of international tribunal and international residual mechanism. Very important is also to add that prosecution on in-country level still continues. So it's that in courts in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and in Kosovo, cases are still being processed. In Croatia, this is not a very large number of cases, not reaching yet 20 cases, but in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there have been more than 100 cases. So it's that this is also important, and I would say that quite often prosecution in countries from Croatia to Kosovo is followed much more patiently than in cases at tribunal. But I have to say that as quite some time have passed, 30 years now from the beginning of war in Croatia, the survivors feel that criminal justice, even when eventually there is a final verdict, that it's delayed and that it came too late. We can look at the cases from perspective of restorative justice and compensations, and I have already mentioned the compensations linked with loss in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Kosovo, which is seen as not sufficient. But I also have to say that in Croatia, actually the rape survivors have received a compensation before other civilian victims of war. So it's that it was seen as the worst and socially most non-acceptable form of crimes. So it's that at restorative justice, I have to address a question of truth-seeking mechanisms, and also want to mention that there have not been special dedicated official truth and reconciliation commissions, but I want to mention a very important work of feminist organizations which found that criminal justice is not sufficient and that survivors are not satisfied with criminal justice only, but want to have eventually truth about what happened spoken. And a very important example of Women Court, which is truth-seeking mechanism which held a session in Sarajevo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in front of nearly 500 participants in the hall, which was once upon a time a synagogue of once upon a time large Jewish community of Sarajevo, but after the Second World War, after Holocaust, became a cultural center, and it's still used as cultural center. So in that historical hall have been held also a session of a women court where women from different post-Yugoslav countries have delivered their testimonies on what happened to them and how they survived. And it is that this was very important for survivors, ones who survived attempted killing or sexual violence, or the ones who eventually lost their sources of living. So it's that this was followed up by sessions of women court in different countries. And it's still actually an ongoing process in which women keep telling their stories. We can also look from perspective of transitional justice and ask a question in a manner of transition from less to more democracy, and how do women, men, and children who have been subjected to sexual violence during the wars of 90s, from 91 to 2001, feel about and have we all as societies come closer to justice. As you have been dealing more with the crimes and sexual violence committed during Second World War, I have to say a bit about Documenta and women rights organizations and civil society organizations which have been supporting survivors in this process of coming to terms with life after war, after sexual violence. And after all transitions we went through, as our countries went through transition from less to more democracy and transition after the war. So it's manifold transitions we lived through. So women's organizations and documentation centers like Documenta actually follow a long line of grassroots peace-building initiatives aiming at challenging denial and persistent public questioning of rape, but also other gross violations of international human rights law.
Our leader is here as well. How are you doing tonight?
Hello?
Okay, go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. Some noisy. Let me check. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes. So it's that we actually still continue with research and education, not just on crimes committed, but general historical education, and hope that that will lead to more inclusive commemorative culture, as there is tendency in our countries to remember and to acknowledge suffering of dominant groups of victims. In Croatia, that would be Croats, and not so much minorities like Serbs, Bosniaks, and others who have also been actually victims and survivors of war crimes. In Bosnia, in the areas where Bosniaks are a majority, they will put more forward the victims of Bosniak Muslim background. Where Serbs are majority, they would put in front victims of Serbian nationality, and in places where Croats are in majority, they would tend to acknowledge suffering of Croats. In Kosovo, there would be tendency to acknowledge mostly suffering of Albanians and not of Serbian, Roma, and Bosniak minority, etc. So human rights and women organizations are actually organizing many activities to stimulate development of society based on values of tolerance to fellow human beings and zero tolerance to violence. So as Documenta, we started our activities in 2004, a long time after the beginning of war, but have been established by two human rights and peace organizations, which actually started their work in 91, 92, and 93. And in order to examine the reasons of polarized and divided collective memory in Croatia and other post-Yugoslav countries, and we actually have very polarized memories and very polarized societies. In context of European and global coming to terms with past, we actually try to look at personal memories and institutional remembrance practices and experiences, while initiating and sustaining social debate on violent past from beginning of World War II, because one period which is very much relativized in our history is history of Second World War, through periods of political violence in its aftermath, in periods of socialist Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1990, and finally to wars of 90s from 91 to 2001. So it's that when we speak about sexual violence, we have very serious reasons to speak about sexual violence in these three periods. And I have to say that sexual violence, which was there also during Second World War, was not specially acknowledged. And it's that right of civilian victims have actually not been dealt with seriously in period of socialist Yugoslavia, as the group which was very much in focus have been actually the partisan veterans of war who won against Nazi coalition and have been part of anti-fascist coalition. So it's that there would be stories to actually be addressed connected to Second World War, which have not been addressed. I have to say that sexual violence related to detention in period of socialist Yugoslavia is not seriously addressed still. The record of sexual violence during wars of 91 to 2001, it's somehow there and stories have been told, but it's patchy and it's still actually in a sign of quite some silences and absences. And it is that a direct support to survivors was very much linked to the centers like Center for Women War Victims, which was established in '92, and organizations established after. I have to say that a very important organization offering health, psychological, direct support to women, Medica, was first established in Bosnia and Herzegovina in Zenica, and now have grown in a network, Medica Mondiale, which offers support to women on feminist base around the world, doing very important work, for example, today in Congo. So it's that I have to say that from work in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you might be familiar with the fact that beside supporting rape survivors, the very important work which have started and unfolded out of Bosnia and Herzegovina and horrors of war there have grown International Commission on Missing Persons, which have eventually been very instrumental in actually identifying more than 70% of missing persons in cooperation with local in-country commissions on missing. And out of a general number of 40,000 forcibly disappeared during wars between 91 and 2001, a bit more than 10,000 remain missing, which is in a global context a good search result, although having still so many forcibly disappeared, it's very difficult for families. And many forcibly disappeared have also experienced sexual violence, although this is nowadays very difficult to prove. Civil society organizations have been also instrumental in documenting research and advocacy and played a very important role in promoting need to provide compensation to survivors. Civil society organizations have been also monitoring war crimes trials, as in our region, criminal justice is seen as the most important step for survivors. This is a bit special. I would say that in post-Yugoslav countries, we're somehow very keen on criminal justice. In our societies, this is very important priority, although we do not have much trust in our judicial institutions. They have been reforming, and I would say they're more able to bring their act together than in the past. But we are still, despite a low trust, seeing the verdicts as a very important road to acknowledging the suffering. I would say that in a period after 2000, the trauma centers for women war victims have gradually been also transforming the dealing with violence against women. And in Croatia, we have a women room center violence, which is dealing with sexual violence in general now, which was established in 2002. We grown out of this work with rape. Although it's, you know, it's that women still don't get support they deserve. Are being done. Society for see.
Yep. Connection is not very good. Besna.
Maybe do it like this. Is it a bit better now?
Yeah, better. Okay.
Okay, so I'll just keep a mic here. That together with organizations of survivors, women, civil society, youth organizations have been advocating coalition for regional truth commission for more than 10 years, because we believe that we need a common narrative. Narratives in our single countries tend to be colored with nationalistic perspectives. We wanted to have a common narrative in sign of multi-perspective view, and advocated this regional commission, which would eventually look at different war crimes, including rape and sexual violence, and establish a common report. But our politicians have not been willing. So we continue our work as civil society organizations in documenting and eventually hope that maybe gradually there will be more political will. I would want to mention that in advocating, art played a very important role. And as I speak now quite long, I would actually go straight to important theater productions. There have been several important theater and film productions addressing the stories of rape survivors. Maybe I want to mention a film Grbavica of Jasmila Žbanić, who also got Berlin award, a Golden Bear Award, and have been seen by many in the region, eventually increasing awareness on fate of rape survivors. But besides, I would also like to mention theater productions which have a smaller public, but as we are currently in civil society organizations looking also on fate of children born of war, the ones who have been born after rape, the very important production in Narodno pozorište in Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in theater in Tuzla, produced in 2019, called In Name of the Father, which was based on transcripts of interviews with children from Bosnia, born of war, which is soon to be performed in Croatia and in Kosovo and in Serbia. And we hope to build a regional campaign related to rights of children born of war, because they sometimes can achieve and can actually succeed in getting some rights, and sometimes not. These children born of war are now girls and boys ages between 30, the oldest, and the youngest a bit more than 10 years in cases from Kosovo and Macedonia. And it's important that eventually they get their space to speak up. So I mentioned some challenges and opportunities. There is still limited political will for accepting duty of the state to develop culture of remembrance and recognize rights of victims. Regarding right to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-reoccurrence. There is still increased risk for human rights defenders and memory workers which deal with these issues, because there is a space mostly for dominant truths instead of allowing for different interpretations. There is limited interest for implementing UN basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations for victims of gross violations of international human rights. But fortunately, there is increased interest for implementing of European Victims' Rights Directive. This European Union directive helps and establishes minimum standards on the rights, support, and protection of victims of crime. and ensure that persons who have fallen victims of crime are recognized and treated with respect. So it's that I would actually underline this increase of interest for implementation of Victims' Rights Directive. This is, of course, something what is obligatory for Slovenia and Croatia, which are members of European Union, but it's more and more important for other post-Yugoslav countries, as they're actually part of integration of European integration process. But historically speaking, and speaking from perspective of education, when we look on the new history books, and this school year we have new history books in Croatia and in Serbia, there is not much space for look on war crimes and sexual violence from position of multi-perspectivity. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to our discussion.